The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana territory as Morningstar crouched behind a cluster of rocks, her heart pounding like a war drum. Her brother's fever had gotten worse during the night, and she knew time was running out. The Poe's supply wagon would pass through Devil's Canyon within the hour, carrying medicines from the fort to the town of Willowbrook. She had no choice but to try. Her hands shook as she checked the old rifle one more time. It belonged to her late father, a weapon she'd hoped never to use against white settlers. But watching her 15-year-old brother burn with fever for 3 days straight had pushed her beyond fear, beyond the careful balance she'd tried to maintain between two worlds. Morningstar had lived most of her 28 years walking that thin line. Born to the Lakota, she'd been taken to the mission school at age 8 after her parents died from the white man's sickness. For 6 years, she learned to read and write in English, to cook their foods, to sew their clothes, and to speak their language without an accent. The missionaries thought they were saving her soul, but all they did was split her heart in two. When she turned 14, she ran back to her people. Her grandmother welcomed her home, but the other tribal members looked at her with suspicion. She dressed like them, spoke their language, and followed their ways, but something had changed inside her. The mission school had planted seeds of doubt about everything she'd once believed without question. Now at 28, she found herself caught between worlds once again. The white settlers saw her as nothing more than a savage despite her education. Her own people sometimes whispered that she'd been too changed by the white man's ways. Only her grandmother and younger brother Little Wolf had ever truly accepted her completely. The sound of wagon wheels on rocky ground brought her back to the present. Her brother needed quinine, and the town doctor wouldn't sell medicine to Indians, no matter how much money they offered. She'd tried 3 times to buy it honestly, only to be turned away with threats and harsh words. The wagon came into view, driven by an older white man with 2 younger ones riding alongside as guards. Morningstar took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle raised but not aimed directly at them. "Stop the wagon," she called out in clear English. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just need medicine." The driver pulled back on the reins, his eyes wide with surprise. "Well, I'll be. She speaks English proper, as you please." One of the guards, a thin man with nervous eyes, reached for his gun. "Don't matter how she talks, Pete. She's still a savage pointing a gun at us. Please," Morningstar said, taking a step closer. "My brother is dying from fever. I tried to buy medicine in town, but they won't sell to my people. Just give me some quinine and I'll let you pass." The older driver, Pete, studied her carefully. He'd been hauling supplies through this territory for 12 years and had seen his share of trouble. But something about this woman was different. She held the rifle like someone who knew how to use it, but her voice carried education and desperation, not hatred. "You're that girl from the mission school, aren't you?" Pete asked suddenly. Sister Catherine used to talk about a bright Lakota girl who could read better than most white folks. Morningstar blinked in surprise. She remembered Sister Catherine, the only teacher at the mission who'd shown her real kindness. "You knew Sister Catherine?" "She was my sister," Pete said quietly. "She died 2 winters back, but she always spoke highly of you, said you had a good heart." The nervous guard shifted in his saddle. "Pete, you can't be thinking of helping her. She's robbing us at gunpoint." "She's asking for medicine for a sick child," Pete corrected. "There's a difference." For a moment, Morningstar felt hope rise in her chest. Maybe this wouldn't end in violence after all. Maybe she could get what she needed and return to Little Wolf before it was too late. But the hope died quickly when the nervous guard suddenly drew his weapon. "I ain't letting no Indian rob us, no matter what sob story she tells." Morningstar spun toward the threat, her finger tightening on the trigger out of pure instinct. The rifle fired with a deafening crack, and the guard's hat flew off his head as he dove sideways off his horse. The bullet had missed him by inches, but the damage was done. "I didn't mean to shoot," Morningstar said, lowering her rifle. "He startled me." But it was too late for explanations. The guard was back on his feet, his own rifle now trained on her. "You tried to kill me, you savage." "Nobody's killing anybody," Pete said firmly, but Morningstar could see the situation spinning out of control. The third man, who'd remained, silent until now, was riding hard back toward Willowbrook to get help. "I'm sorry," Morningstar whispered. Knowing her words were useless now, she dropped her rifle and raised her hands. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Within an hour, Sheriff Coleman arrived with 6 men from town. They found Morningstar sitting quietly on a rock, her rifle on the ground beside her, waiting for whatever came next. She'd given up trying to run. Little Wolf would die with or without the medicine now, and she was too tired to keep fighting a world that saw her as nothing more than a threat to be eliminated. "Well, well," Sheriff Coleman said as he dismounted. "If it isn't the mission school. Indian. Should have known you'd go back to your savage ways eventually." Morningstar said nothing as they bound her hands with rough rope. She'd learned long ago that defending herself to men like Coleman only made things worse. He'd been sheriff for 8 years and had made it clear from the beginning that he considered all Indians to be problems waiting to happen. "She tried to murder Bill," the nervous guard told the sheriff, pointing at Morningstar. "Shot right at his head. Would have killed him if he hadn't been quick." "That's not true," Pete tried to interrupt. "She was only after medicine for her sick brother." "Shut up, old man," Coleman snapped. "I don't care if she wanted medicine or gold. She held up a wagon train and fired on honest citizens. That's attempted murder and armed robbery in my book." As they loaded Morningstar into the sheriff's wagon, she caught sight of a man standing apart from the crowd. He was tall and lean, with work-roughened hands and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this harsh land. A small boy, maybe 7 years old, stood beside him, clutching the man's leg and staring at Morningstar with curious rather than fearful eyes. The man, Thomas McKenna, watched the proceedings with growing unease. He'd come to town for supplies and found himself witnessing what felt more like a lynching than justice. The woman in the sheriff's wagon didn't look like the bloodthirsty savage the guard was describing. She looked tired, defeated, and heartbroken. "Pa," his son Jamie whispered. "Why does she look so sad?" Thomas didn't have a good answer for that. His wife had died 2 years ago, giving birth to their second child, who'd lived only 3 days. Since then, he'd been raising Jamie alone while trying to keep their small ranch running. He understood desperation, the kind that made people do things they never thought they'd do. "I don't know, son," he said quietly. "Sometimes people get pushed into corners they can't get out of." Back in the wagon, Morningstar closed her eyes and tried not to think about Little Wolf, alone and burning with fever. By the time this was over, he'd either be dead or recovered on his own. Either way, she'd failed him, just like she'd failed at everything else she'd tried to do with her life. The jail in Willowbrook was little more than a wooden box with iron bars on the windows. They threw Morningstar into the single cell and left her there without food or water. Through the small window she could see people gathering in the street, their voices getting louder as word spread about the savage who'd tried to murder innocent white men. "String her up now and save the territory the cost of a trial," someone shouted. "Make an example of her so the rest of them savages know what happens when they cross us," another voice added. Morningstar sat on the narrow cot and tried to block out the angry voices. She thought about her grandmother, who taught her that every soul had a purpose in the great circle of life. She wondered what her purpose had been, if this was how her story was meant to end. Judge Harrison arrived on the afternoon train, a stern man in his 60s who'd built his reputation on harsh sentences for anyone who threatened the peace of his territory. He took one look at Morningstar and saw exactly what he expected to see. Another Indian who'd proven that you could take them out of the wilderness, but you couldn't take the wilderness out of them. "Trial starts tomorrow morning," he announced to Sheriff Coleman. "Have the prosecutor ready with his case. This shouldn't take long." Thomas McKenna heard about the trial from his neighbor, who'd ridden out to tell him the news. The whole territory was talking about the educated Indian woman who'd gone bad. Some folks were already planning to make a day of it, bringing their families to watch justice being served. "They say she speaks English better than most white folks," his neighbor said. "Went to that mission school for years. But you can't trust them, Tom. Savage is as savage does." Thomas said nothing, but something about the whole situation bothered him. He'd seen the woman's eyes when they loaded her into the wagon. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The makeshift courthouse filled with people before sunrise. Settlers had traveled from farms and ranches 50 miles away to witness what everyone expected would be a quick trial and quicker sentencing. The general store had run out of supplies, feeding all the visitors, and the hotel was packed with folks who'd made the journey specially for this event. Thomas McKenna stood at the back of the crowded room with Jamie beside him. He'd told himself he came to town for supplies, but deep down he knew he needed to see this through. Something about yesterday's capture hadn't sit right with him all night. When they brought Morning Star in, the crowd's murmur grew louder. She walked with her head high, her long black hair braided simply down her back. She wore the same buckskin dress from yesterday, now dusty and wrinkled from her night in jail. Her hands were still bound, but she moved with a dignity that surprised many in the room. Judge Harrison banged his gavel hard. "This court is now in session. We're here to try the defendant on charges of armed robbery and conspiracy to commit murder." The prosecutor, a thin man named William Fletcher, stood up with obvious confidence. He'd prosecuted dozens of cases involving Indians and had never lost one. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. The defendant held up a wagon train at gunpoint and fired a weapon at an innocent citizen. The evidence is clear, the witnesses are reliable, and the law is on our side." Morning Star's court-appointed defender, a young lawyer named Robert Collins, looked nervous and unprepared. He'd arrived on the morning train and had spent less than 10 minutes talking to his client. Everyone knew he was just going through the motions to make the trial look proper. "Does the defendant have anything to say before we begin?" Judge Harrison asked. Morning Star stood slowly. The room fell completely silent, everyone straining to hear what she might say. For a long moment, she looked around the packed courthouse, her eyes touching on face after face of people who'd already decided her guilt. "I will not speak," she said simply, her English clear and precise. "You have already chosen what you believe." Judge Harrison frowned. "Young woman, this is your chance to defend yourself. I suggest you take it." "Why?" Morning Star asked. "Will my words change what you've decided? Will they bring back my brother who died last night while I sat in your jail?" Her voice remained steady, but Thomas saw her hands shake slightly. "I know what I am to you. Speak or stay silent, it makes no difference." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Several people leaned forward, clearly not expecting such articulate speech from someone they'd labeled a savage. Prosecutor Fletcher called his first witness, the nervous guard named Bill Henderson. Henderson took the stand and immediately launched into his story, painting Morning Star as a bloodthirsty attacker who'd tried to murder him in cold blood. "She came out of nowhere, pointing that rifle right at us," Henderson said, his voice shaking, with remembered fear. "Demanded we give her our supplies. When I tried to protect myself in the wagon, she fired that gun right at my head. Would have killed me sure if I hadn't ducked." "And you're certain she intended to kill you?" Fletcher asked. "Absolutely. You could see the hatred in her eyes. These savages, they're raised from birth to hate white folks. Give them half a chance, and they'll scalp you soon as look at you." Thomas felt his jaw clench at the words. From where he stood, he could see Morning Star's profile. Her face showed no emotion, but he noticed how she looked down at her bound hands when Henderson talked about hatred in her eyes. The second guard testified next, backing up Henderson's story. Then Pete, the wagon driver, took the stand. Thomas leaned forward, hoping the older man might offer a different perspective. "Pete, you were there when this Indian attacked your wagon," Fletcher said. "Tell the court what you saw." Pete looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Morning Star, then at the prosecutor, then at the packed courthouse. "Well, she did stop our wagon and ask for medicine." "At gunpoint," Fletcher prompted. "Yes, she had a rifle, but she said she didn't want to hurt nobody. Said she just needed medicine for her sick brother." Fletcher's expression tightened. "Did she or did she not fire that weapon at Mr. Henderson?" "The rifle went off, yes, but I think it was an accident." She seemed just as surprised as anybody when it happened. "An accident?" Fletcher's voice rose. "Pete, she was robbing you at gunpoint. How can you call it an accident?" Pete shifted in his chair. Look, I knew this girl years back. My sister Catherine taught at the mission school, and she always said, Morningstar was a good student. Smart, polite, never caused trouble. Judge Harrison interrupted. The defendant's school record isn't relevant here, Pete. Did she threaten you with a weapon or not? Pete's shoulders sagged. She had a rifle, yes, sir. When it came time for the defense, Robert Collins called no witnesses. He made a brief, half-hearted argument about desperate circumstances and asked for mercy, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Morningstar sat silently through his entire presentation, showing no reaction to his words. During a brief recess, Thomas found himself standing near the jail cell's window. Morningstar was inside, staring out at the mountains in the distance. Without really thinking about it, he approached the bars. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said quietly. Morningstar turned toward him, studying his face. "You're the man with the small boy." "Thomas McKenna. And yes, that's my son Jamie." He paused, not sure why he was there or what he wanted to say. "I lost someone too. My wife. I know what it's like when someone you love is sick and you can't help them." For the first time since her capture, Morningstar's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. "Little Wolf was all I had left. Our grandmother died last winter. Our parents have been gone since we were children." "The mission school," Thomas said. "You really went there?" "For 6 years, Sister Catherine taught me to read and write. She said education was the path to understanding between our peoples." Morningstar's voice carried a bitter edge. "I believed her then. What changed?" Morningstar looked at him for a long moment. "I tried to live in your world. I dressed like white women, spoke your language, learned your customs. But when I applied for work in town, they called me a savage and sent me away. When I tried to buy medicine honestly, they refused to sell to me. Your people see only what they want to see." Thomas had no answer for that. He'd seen the same attitudes in Willowbrook, the way people talked about Indians as if they were wild animals instead of human beings. "Why didn't you tell the court about trying to buy the medicine first?" he asked. Morningstar's laugh was hollow. "Would it matter? They've already decided I'm guilty. The trial is just a show for their consciences." When court resumed, the jury was sent out to deliberate. Thomas expected them to take at least an hour, maybe 2. They were back in 45 minutes. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Judge Harrison had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Morningstar remained perfectly still, as if she'd been carved from stone. "The defendant will rise for sentencing," Judge Harrison commanded. Morningstar stood slowly, her bound hands clasped in front of her. "Morningstar of the Lakota people," Judge Harrison intoned, "you have been found guilty of armed robbery and conspiracy to commit murder. These are serious crimes that strike at the very heart of law and order in this territory. The settlers of Montana have the right to travel safely without fear of attack from hostile Indians." Thomas felt sick listening to the words. The judge was talking about Morningstar, as if she were part of some larger conspiracy instead of a desperate woman trying to save her brother's life. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your actions show that despite the Christian education you received, you have returned to the savage ways of your people. You represent a danger to every honest citizen of this territory." Morningstar finally spoke. "I am not savage, I am desperate. There is a difference." Judge Harrison's eyes flashed with anger. "Your refusal to show proper remorse only proves my point. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be taken from here to a place of execution and hanged by the neck until dead. Sentence to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence." The courthouse erupted again, but this time Thomas heard a different note in the voices. Some people cheered, but others seemed shocked by the death sentence. A few women gasped, and he heard someone say, "Hanging? For trying to get medicine?" Morningstar's face showed no change, but Thomas saw her hands tremble slightly. She looked very young suddenly, and very alone. As the crowd began to file out, discussing the trial and the upcoming execution, Thomas remained in his spot at the back of the room. Jamie tugged on his sleeve. "Pa, why does the pretty lady have to die?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. I don't know, son. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make much sense. That evening, back at their ranch, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the trial. He kept seeing Morningstar's face when the sentence was announced, the way she'd stood so straight and proud even when they condemned her to death. Jamie had been unusually quiet during supper, picking at his food and staring out the window. Finally, he looked up at his father with serious eyes. Pa, is the lady really bad like they said? Thomas McKenna woke before dawn on the second day after the trial, his mind immediately returning to the impossible idea that had haunted him all night. He dressed quietly and stepped onto his porch, watching the sun paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and red. In 36 hours, Morningstar would be dead. Jamie appeared beside him, still in his nightgown, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Pa, you're up early again. Thomas pulled his son close, feeling the boy's warm weight against his side. Couldn't sleep, son. Too much thinking. About the sad lady? The simple question cut straight to Thomas's heart. Yes, about the sad lady. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their small herd of cattle graze in the morning light. Thomas had built this ranch from nothing after the war, working 18-hour days to clear the land, build the cabin, and establish his place in this harsh territory. When he married Catherine 5 years ago, it had felt like his life was finally complete. Now Catherine was gone and he was struggling to raise Jamie alone while keeping the ranch running. The boy needed more than Thomas could give him. Jamie needed patience for his endless questions, gentle hands to tend his scraped knees, and soft words to chase away the nightmares that still came too often. Pa, Jamie said suddenly, do you remember what Mama used to say about helping people? Thomas's throat tightened. Catherine had always seen the good in everyone, sometimes to a fault. What did she say, son? She said that helping people wasn't about whether they deserved it. She said it was about whether we could live with ourselves if we didn't try. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Catherine had said exactly that. Many times, usually when she was tending to a sick neighbor or bringing food to a struggling family. She'd never asked if people deserved her help. She'd simply seen a need and tried to fill it. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his horse and rode into town, telling himself he just needed supplies. But his feet carried him to the jail, where Sheriff Coleman sat outside whittling a piece of wood. Morning, Tom, Coleman said without looking up. You hear about the execution? Getting to be quite the event. Folks coming from 3 counties to watch. The casual way Coleman talked about Morningstar's death made Thomas sick. I wanted to see her. Coleman's knife paused. See her? Why? Thomas had prepared an answer. My wife always taught Jamie to pray for people in trouble. The boy asked me to check on her, make sure she's not suffering. It was true enough. Catherine would have done exactly that, and Jamie had asked about Morningstar several times. Coleman shrugged. Suit yourself, but don't take too long. Judge Harrison doesn't want folks getting too friendly with her. The jail smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Morningstar sat on the narrow cot, her back straight, staring at the small window. She'd managed to braid her hair neatly despite her bound hands, and someone had brought her a clean dress, though it was too big for her small frame. Mrs. Thomas started, then stopped. What did you call a condemned woman? Morningstar? She turned toward him, recognition flickering in her dark eyes. The rancher with the boy. Thomas McKenna, I brought you some food. He set a basket on the small table outside her cell. My son wanted to make sure you were all right. Morningstar's expression softened slightly. Your son is kind. What is his name? Jamie. He's 7. I had a student at the mission school about his age. Little white boy whose parents died in an Indian attack. He was so angry when he first came to us, full of hate for my people. Morningstar moved closer to the bars, but children's hearts heal faster than adults. By the time he left, he called me sister. Thomas studied her face. You taught at the mission school? For 2 years, after I finished my own education there. I thought I could help bridge the gap between our peoples, teach white children that Indians could be more than the stories they'd heard. Her laugh was bitter. Another foolish dream. What happened to make you leave? Morningstar was quiet for a moment. A new superintendent arrived. He said having an Indian teacher sent the wrong message to the white children, that it might make them think Indians were their equals. The casual cruelty of it made Thomas angry. So you went back to your tribe. Where else could I go? Your world didn't want me, but at least my people accepted me, even if I no longer fit perfectly there either. Thomas pulled up the old chair that sat outside the cell. Tell me about your brother. Pain flashed across Morningstar's features. Little Wolf was 12 when our parents died. I raised him from then on. He was smart like you wouldn't believe. Could track better than men twice his age, knew every bird call, every plant that could heal or harm. Her voice grew softer. He wanted to go to the mission school too, to learn to read. I was saving money to send him. The money from robbing wagons? Morningstar's eyes flashed. I never robbed wagons before that day. I worked as a seamstress for the wives of soldiers at the fort. They paid me half what they'd pay a white woman, but it was honest work. Then why that day? What made you desperate enough to try? Little Wolf had been sick for a week, burning with fever, barely conscious. I'd used every remedy our grandmother taught me, but nothing helped. I knew he needed white man's medicine, quinine. Morningstar's hands clenched. I went to Dr. Peterson 3 times. I had money, real money. But he wouldn't see Little Wolf, said he didn't treat savages. Thomas felt a familiar anger building. He'd heard Dr. Peterson make similar comments before. The man treated animals better than he treated Indians. The fever was getting worse, Morningstar continued. Little Wolf started having seizures. Our grandmother always said that when the spirit begins to leave the body, you can see it in the eyes. I saw that look in Little Wolf's eyes that morning. So you decided to take the medicine by force. I decided my brother's life was worth more than white men's laws. Morningstar met his gaze directly. I'm not sorry for trying. I'm only sorry I failed. Thomas sat in silence for a moment, absorbing her words. This wasn't the savage the court had described. This was a woman who'd been pushed beyond her limits, who'd watched her last remaining family member dying while the people who could help refused even to try. Morningstar, he said carefully, do you know about territorial marriage law? She frowned. I know some of your laws. Why? Thomas felt his heart hammering. There's a provision that allows a condemned woman to escape execution if a man of good standing agrees to marry her and take responsibility for her crimes. Morningstar stared at him. You're talking about buying a condemned criminal as a wife. I'm talking about saving your life. Why? The question came out sharp, suspicious. What would you gain from such a marriage? Thomas had been asking himself the same question all morning. My son needs a mother. I need help with the ranch. You need to live. And you think because I'm desperate, I'll be grateful enough to be a good wife to a stranger? The challenge in her voice made Thomas respect her even more. Even facing death, she wouldn't accept charity that came with strings attached. I think you're an educated woman who's been dealt a bad hand by life, Thomas said honestly. I think you love children since you taught them. I think you know what it's like to lose everything and start over. And I think my son already likes you, which is more than I can say for most people he meets. Morningstar was quiet for a long time. What kind of marriage are you proposing? What would you expect from me? Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. I'm not looking for a real wife, if that's what you mean. I'm looking for someone to help raise Jamie, help around the ranch. We'd figure out the rest as we went along. And if I said no, then you'd hang tomorrow morning, and I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved you. Morningstar turned away, staring out the small window again. Your neighbors would never accept an Indian wife. They'd make your life miserable. Maybe. But they'd get used to it eventually. You don't know that. Some of them might never forgive you for saving me. Thomas had thought about that too. Some things are more important than what the neighbors think. Like what? Like being able to look my son in the eye when he asks why I let someone die when I could have saved them. Morningstar was quiet for so long that Thomas began to think she'd decided against him. Finally, she spoke without turning around. I would want to visit Little Wolf's grave. Of course, and I would want to continue some of my own traditions, not just adopt yours completely. That seems fair. And if this marriage doesn't work, if we find we can't live together, what happens then? Thomas had no good answer for that. I guess we'd figure it out when we came to it. Morningstar finally turned to face him. Why are you really doing this, and don't tell me it's just about needing help with your son? Thomas was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. When my wife was dying, she made me promise to teach Jamie that all people have value, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Yesterday, watching your trial, I realized I was failing her. So you're doing this for your dead wife? I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Because you don't deserve to die for trying to save your brother's life. Because my son sees something in you that a whole courtroom full of adults missed. Thomas met her gaze. And because maybe we can help each other start over. Thomas barely slept the night before the execution. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through what he planned to do over and over in his mind. Each time he imagined stepping forward to invoke the marriage law, his chest tightened with fear. Not fear of Morningstar, but fear of what his neighbors would think, what they might do, how this decision would change his and Jamie's lives forever. At 4 a.m, he gave up trying to sleep and went to the kitchen to make coffee. His hands shook as he worked, and he spilled water twice before managing to get the pot on the stove. Through the window, he could see the first hint of dawn lighting the eastern mountains. Jamie padded into the kitchen in his bare feet, his hair sticking up in all directions. Pa, are you sick? No, son. Just couldn't sleep. Jamie climbed onto a chair and studied his father's face with the serious attention children gave to important matters. Are you scared about today? Thomas had never lied to his son about important things, and he wasn't going to start now. Yes, Jamie, I'm scared. About helping Morningstar? About what happens after we help her? Jamie reached across the table and patted his father's hand with small, warm fingers. Mama used to say that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, but not doing it feels worse. Thomas smiled despite his nerves. Your mama was a wise woman. Will you tell Morningstar that I'm glad she's not going to die? I will, son. By sunrise, people were already gathering in the town square around the hastily built gallows. Thomas had never seen so many folks in Willowbrook at one time. Men, women, and even children had come from all over the territory to witness what many saw as justice being served. Thomas hitched his wagon and helped Jamie climb up beside him. The boy had insisted on coming, saying someone needed to be there to support Morningstar. Thomas hadn't had the heart to tell him no. The ride into town felt like the longest journey of Thomas's life. Every familiar landmark seemed to mock him. There was the creek where he'd taught Jamie to fish. There was the hill where Catherine used to pick wildflowers. There was the meadow where he'd proposed to her 5 years ago. All of it would still be here after today, but his place in this community might be gone forever. Pa, Jamie said as they neared town, what if people get really mad at us? Thomas had been wondering the same thing. Then we'll deal with it together. But Jamie, once I do this, there's no taking it back. Are you sure you're ready for people to be angry with us? Jamie was quiet for a moment, swinging his legs as he thought. Will Morningstar be nice to us? I think so. She seems like a good person who's had some bad luck. And she'll help take care of me like Mama did. She'll try her best. Jamie nodded firmly. Then I don't care if people are mad. We'll have each other, and that's what matters. The town square was packed with people when they arrived. Someone had set up tables selling food and drink, turning the execution into a festival. Children ran between the crowd playing games while their parents talked excitedly about the morning's entertainment. Thomas felt sick watching it all. These people were treating Morningstar's death like a celebration, as if ending a human life was cause for joy. Sheriff Coleman stood near the gallows talking to Judge Harrison and several other important men from town. The judge looked satisfied, like a man who'd done a good day's work. Sheriff Coleman kept checking his pocket watch, clearly eager to get the proceedings started. "There's quite a turnout," said a voice beside Thomas. He turned to find Dr. Peterson, the same man who'd refused to treat Little Wolf. Should be a good lesson for any other savages thinking about causing trouble. Thomas bit back the angry words that rose to his throat. "She was just trying to get medicine for her sick brother," Dr. Peterson snorted. "That's what she claimed. But you can't trust what these Indians say. They're natural-born liars, every one of them. Even the ones educated in mission schools? Especially those ones. Education just makes them more dangerous, gives them ideas above their station." Dr. Peterson adjusted his hat. "Mark my words, McKenna. The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Thomas moved away from the doctor before he said something he'd regret. Around him, the crowd continued to grow. He spotted several of his neighbors, people he'd known for years, all chatting happily about the upcoming execution. At exactly 8 o'clock, they brought Morning Star out of the jail. The crowd fell silent, watching as she walked between Sheriff Coleman and his deputy toward the gallows. She'd somehow managed to clean her dress and braid her hair with small wildflowers woven through it. Her hands were bound behind her back, but she walked with her head high and her shoulders straight. Thomas felt Jamie grab his arm. "Pa, she looks so brave." She did look brave, Thomas realized. Terrified, but brave. She climbed the steps to the gallows platform without stumbling, even though her legs must have been shaking. When Sheriff Coleman positioned her on the trapdoor, she looked out over the crowd with calm dignity. Judge Harrison stepped forward with a paper in his hand. "Morning Star of the Lakota people, you have been condemned to death for the crimes of armed robbery and conspiracy to commit murder. Do you have any last words?" The crowd leaned forward, eager to hear what the condemned woman might say. Morning Star was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the sea of faces. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "I am not sorry for trying to save my brother's life. I am only sorry that there was no other way." She paused, her eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. "I hope someday your children will live in a world where the color of their skin doesn't determine whether they live or die." The crowd murmured at her words. Some people seemed surprised by her eloquence, while others muttered angrily about savages who didn't know their place. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with the noose, and Thomas felt his moment arriving. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. Jamie squeezed his arm encouragingly. "Any final words?" Judge Harrison asked again. This was it. Thomas took a deep breath and pushed forward through the crowd. "Wait." The crowd turned toward him, confused by the interruption. Judge Harrison frowned as Thomas made his way to the front of the platform. "I invoke the territorial marriage law," Thomas shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I claim the right to marry this woman and take responsibility for her crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted in angry voices. "What's he doing?" "He can't do that. McKenna's lost his mind." Judge Harrison's face went red with anger. "Thomas McKenna, are you certain you know what you're doing?" Thomas looked up at Morning Star, who was staring down at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Your Honor. I'm invoking my legal right under territorial law to marry the condemned woman and accept responsibility for her actions." "This is outrageous," someone shouted from the crowd. "You can't let him save a murdering savage. She's a criminal," another voice added. "She needs to hang." Judge Harrison banged his gavel, trying to restore order. "Quiet, everyone be quiet." Thomas climbed the steps to the gallows platform, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Up close, he could see Morning Star trembling, though she was trying hard not to show it. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "Are you?" he whispered back. She nodded, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. Judge Harrison looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Mr. McKenna, are you a man of good standing in this community?" "I own my ranch free and clear. I pay my taxes, and I've never been convicted of any crime," Thomas replied. "I believe that qualifies me under the law." "And you're willing to accept full legal responsibility for this woman's crimes?" Thomas felt the weight of the moment. Once he said yes, there would be no going back. Morning Star would be his responsibility for the rest of their lives. I am. The judge turned to Morning Star. And you, woman, do you consent to this marriage? Morning Star's voice was barely above a whisper. I do. Judge Harrison looked around at the angry crowd, clearly wishing he could find a way out of this situation. But the law was the law, and too many important people were watching for him to ignore it. Very well, he said through gritted teeth. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. He looked at Thomas with disgust. May God help you both. The crowd's anger reached a fever pitch. People were shouting and pushing forward, their faces twisted with rage. Thomas quickly untied Morning Star's hands and helped her down from the gallows platform, shielding her with his body as they made their way through the hostile crowd. Traitor! Someone screamed at him. Indian lover! Another voice added. You'll regret this, McKenna. Thomas kept walking, one arm around Morning Star's shoulders, the other reaching for Jamie, who had fought his way through the crowd to reach them. The three of them made it to Thomas's wagon, but barely. As Thomas helped Morning Star up onto the wagon seat, he saw Dr. Peterson pushing through the crowd toward them. McKenna, you've lost your mind. That savage tried to kill innocent people. She tried to save her brother's life, Thomas replied, climbing up beside Morning Star. She's a criminal, a murderer. She's my wife, Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried enough authority that Dr. Peterson stepped back. As they drove out of town, the crowd followed them to the edge of the first few weeks of marriage were awkward in ways Thomas had never imagined. He'd given Morning Star the small back room that he'd originally built as a storage area, hastily moving boxes and fixing up a proper bed. She accepted the arrangement, without complaint, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes as she tried to adjust to this strange new life. Jamie, surprisingly, was the one who made everything easier. While Thomas and Morning Star danced around each other with careful politeness, his 7-year-old son simply accepted their new family member as if she'd always belonged there. Morning Star, Jamie announced on their third day together, I think you should teach me to braid my hair like yours. Morning Star looked surprised. Boys in your culture don't usually braid their hair. But I'm not just from Pa's culture now, Jamie said with the simple logic that only children possessed. I'm from your culture too, aren't I? Since you're my ma now. Thomas saw tears spring to Morning Star's eyes at the word ma. She knelt down to Jamie's level and showed him how to weave small sections of hair together. Watching them work together in the morning sunlight, Thomas felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight. The neighbors were a different story entirely. Within a week, 3 families had stopped speaking to Thomas, altogether. When he went to town for supplies, conversations died when he walked into a room. Children were pulled away when they tried to play with Jamie. The worst incident came when Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the guard who'd testified against Morning Star, confronted Thomas outside the general store. How could you do this to your poor, dead wife's memory? She hissed, her face red with anger. Marrying that savage right where Catherine used to shop. Thomas felt his temper flare. My wife would have been proud of what I did. She believed in helping people who needed help. She believed in helping decent white folks, not murderous Indians. Mrs. Henderson snapped back. That woman tried to kill my husband. That woman was trying to save her dying brother. You're a fool, Thomas McKenna. And you're raising your son to be a fool too. Thomas walked away before he said something he'd regret. But her words stung, more than he cared to admit. Was he being a fool? Was he putting Jamie in danger by bringing Morning Star into their lives? When he got home, he found Morning Star in the vegetable garden, carefully tending the plants that Catherine had started before she died. She looked up as he approached, and he could see she'd been crying. Someone threw rocks at the house while you were gone, she said quietly. They broke one of your windows. Thomas felt rage building in his chest. Did you see who it was? It doesn't matter who it was. What matters is that it's going to keep happening. Morning Star stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. Thomas, maybe I should leave, find somewhere else to go. You and Jamie shouldn't have to suffer because of me. Where would you go? Morningstar was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Maybe I could find work somewhere far away, where nobody knows about the trial. Running away isn't the answer. Neither is staying here and making everyone miserable. Thomas looked at the broken window, then at Morningstar's defeated expression. This wasn't how he'd imagined things would go. He'd saved her life, but what kind of life was it if she lived in constant fear? That evening, after Jamie was in bed, Thomas and Morningstar sat on the front porch talking. It had become their routine, these quiet conversations after the boy was asleep. They were getting to know each other slowly, sharing stories from their different worlds. Tell me about your wife, Morningstar said suddenly. Thomas was surprised by the request. They'd carefully avoided talking about Catherine, as if mentioning her might make their marriage feel even more artificial than it already was. She was kind, Thomas said finally. Sometimes too kind for her own good. She'd bring food to families even when we barely had enough for ourselves. She'd sit up all night with sick neighbors. She sounds like a good person. She was. She would have liked you. Morningstar looked skeptical. You think so? I know so. Catherine always said that people who suffered taught her the most about what really mattered in life. She would have seen your strength, not just your troubles. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the evening. Finally, Morningstar spoke again. I want to visit Little Wolf's grave tomorrow. Would you come with me? Thomas nodded. Of course. The next morning, they rode out together to the small cemetery where Morningstar had buried her brother. It was a simple grave marked with stones arranged in a traditional Lakota pattern. Morningstar knelt beside it and spoke quietly in her native language, while Thomas and Jamie stood respectfully nearby. I told him about you, she said when she stood up. I told him that I found people who would help me start over. On the way home, they encountered their neighbor Ben Wilson fixing a fence by the road. Wilson had always been friendly before, but now he barely acknowledged Thomas's greeting and pointedly ignored Morningstar entirely. Why was that man mean to Morningstar? Jamie asked when they'd passed. Because some people are afraid of things they don't understand, Thomas explained. But Morningstar isn't scary, she's nice. You and I know that. But Mr. Wilson only knows what other people have told him about Indians. Jamie thought about this seriously. Maybe we should invite him for dinner so he can see how nice she really is. Thomas smiled at his son's innocence. Maybe we should. But before they could extend any dinner invitations, Morningstar's knowledge proved invaluable in ways that began to change some minds in the community. It started when the banker's daughter came down with a high fever that Dr. Peterson couldn't break. The little girl, Lucy, was burning up and having convulsions. Dr. Peterson had tried everything he knew, but nothing was working. Thomas was in town buying feed when he overheard the banker, Frank Morrison, talking desperately to anyone who would listen. She's getting worse, Morrison said, his voice cracking. The doctor says there's nothing more he can do. We might lose her. Thomas thought about Morningstar's extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, knowledge she'd gained both from her grandmother and her time at the mission school. Without really thinking about it, he approached Morrison. Frank, I know this might sound strange, but my wife knows a lot about treating fevers. She learned from the missionaries and from her own people. Maybe she could help. Morrison's face went through several emotions at once. Hope, desperation, and disgust battled for control. Your Indian wife? She's had medical training, Frank, and she's treated children before. Morrison looked around the street, clearly torn between his prejudices and his love for his daughter. Finally, desperation won. Bring her, please. When they arrived at the Morrison house, Dr. Peterson was just leaving. He took one look at Morningstar and shook his head in disgust. Frank, you can't be serious about letting this savage touch your daughter. She might be able to help, Morrison said weakly. She's more likely to finish the job than help. Indians don't heal, they kill. Morningstar had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke up. Dr. Peterson, what treatments Have you already tried? Peterson looked startled to be addressed directly. I've bled her, given her laudanum for the pain, and tried cold compresses. Nothing's working. Morningstar nodded thoughtfully. May I see her? Inside the house, Lucy Morrison lay unconscious in her bed, her small body burning with fever. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand and crying softly. Morningstar knelt beside the bed and gently felt the little girl's forehead, neck, and pulse. How long has she had the fever? Morningstar asked. 3 days, Mrs. Morrison whispered. It just keeps getting worse. Morningstar was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she turned to Morrison. I need willow bark, elderberry, and peppermint. Do you have any of these? I don't know. What do you need them for? Willow bark reduces fever naturally. Elderberry helps the body fight infection. Peppermint helps with nausea and makes the other medicines easier to take. Morningstar looked at Lucy's pale face. The bleeding has weakened her. Her body needs strength to fight the fever, not more weakness, Dr. Peterson snorted. Primitive superstition. The missionaries at my school taught us that many Indian remedies work as well as white medicine, Morningstar replied, calmly. Sometimes better. Mrs. Morrison looked up with desperate hope. If you think you can help her, please try. Morningstar spent the next hour preparing her medicines, while the Morrison family watched anxiously. She made a tea from willow bark and elderberry, then added peppermint to make it taste better. She also prepared cool compresses using herbs that would help draw the heat from Lucy's body. Give her small sips of this every few minutes, Morningstar instructed Mrs. Morrison. Don't try to force too much at once, and keep the compresses cool and wet. Dr. Peterson shook his head and left, muttering about foolish people trusting Indian witchcraft. But Thomas stayed with Morningstar as she worked patiently through the afternoon, monitoring Lucy's condition and adjusting her treatments. By evening, Lucy's fever had broken. She woke up asking for water, and her mother, weak but clearly recovering. Mrs. Morrison burst into tears and hugged Morningstar so hard that both women nearly fell over. Thank you, she sobbed. Thank you for saving my baby.